Welcome to our Wednesday night Visualized Bible study. Tonight we're going to have one of those very interesting things that there are a lot of things that happened. We're going to take a look at Jesus and how he related to the disciples when they were afraid. The resource books I'm going to use tonight is If You Want to Walk on Water, You've Got to Get Out of the Boat. It's by John Ortberg. It's a very good book, but John Ortberg, you have to get used to his writing because it's very down home. The second one's by Adam Hamilton, and it's entitled Simon Peter. He's a very good historical detailed writer, and so I'll be using them tonight in what I've prepared. We're going to start by looking at our opening question. Tell us about a frightening experience you once had. Teresa Nagel said, when my daughter died while delivering Olivia, thankfully, answered prayer and a wonderful care team at Winnie Palmer Hospital were able to save her. Sushi Mate writes, when our 3-year-old daughter wandered away at a large indoor mall in Pittsburgh and was missing for over an hour. Wanda Bauer writes, my youngest son was on the critical list for 19 days after suffering a brain bleed. Jackie Smith writes, when my brother and I followed the dogs down into the holler and couldn't find our way back home. That's a good Alabama way of looking at it. Katrina Nobles writes, 2 bank robberies, and I saw a woman hit by a car. Amanda Underwood writes, my sister and I were in a head-on collision. They told us if we'd not worn our seatbelts, we never would have survived. Up to then, I usually didn't wear my seatbelt. Fran Robinson writes, we went shopping for shoes for school for the 2 oldest children, carrying Matt in a carrier. Melissa, 6, wanted a pair of high heels, and I told her she wasn't old enough. While fitting shoes on Michael, Melissa ran off, and we didn't find her for 45 minutes, and she was the other end of the mall. Joe Vanover said in 2001, I was diagnosed with Wegener's disease. After 3 weeks in the hospital, the doctor told me I had 6 months to live. Oh, wow. Sue Coleman writes, we moved to Georgia from Florida with family. My 5-year-old son wanted to go back to Florida, so he ran off taking the dog. Eventually, after we called the police and the whole community was looking for him, they found him walking down the railroad tracks. He thought it would take him back to Florida. Some big-time stuff. Jesus had some big things happen in his life. This is important.
Be of good cheer. It is I. Be not afraid.
Lord, if it be thou, bid me come unto thee on the water.
Come. Lord, save me. O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? Of a truth, thou art the Son of God.
This tops off one of those days. Jesus is going through some emotional highs and emotional lows that I think he just found it hard to keep on keeping on. It was at this time that John the Baptizer was killed by Herod. They let him have the body, and they took the body out and they burned it, which was one of the traditions of their day. But the emotional impact on Jesus was immediate. He gets in a boat and tries to get away from the crowd, but the crowd finds out where he's going. And so when they put into shore again, they're there. And he spends the rest of his time healing the sick. He hasn't had a break. And yet he's hurting and looking for some way to make this day work. In Matthew 14:15 through 21, as evening approached, the disciples came and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away to the villages so they can buy some food for themselves." And Jesus replies, "They don't need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes and looking up into heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves, and he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. Everybody ate until they were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Now that takes a little explaining too. They only counted men. They were the only ones who were significant. And women and children, they didn't count. So it was 5,000 plus women and children that got to eat. And after Jesus had taken 5 loaves and 2 fish and fed thousands of people, the disciples gathered it up and they start back amazed at what just has happened. And Jesus takes them down and puts them in a boat, lets them go on ahead of him. Now, this boat has recently been found, and it wasn't a huge thing. In fact, what they found out, the boat was 27 feet long, and it was 7.5 feet wide. It had a height of about 4.3. They found it during a drought when the waters of the Sea of Galilee went under a drought in 1986. So they're in a boat by themselves, the 12 of them, and a boat that's not a ship, it's a dinghy. Jesus has gone up into the mountains to pray. It's a common thing for him. And as he gets up into the mountains, he prays all night until the 4th watch. That's 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So tell about your times of prayer. We have several great answers. Wanda Bauer, I prayed for 20-some days to know my son was past the critical stage. Karen Vester, when I prayed for over 1 year for the relief of my mind and soul and body after the death of my son. It did finally come in stages, I believe, when I was ready to accept what God really wanted for me. Jackie Hall writes, I prayed so long that God would take Dave before his diseases became too painful and debilitating. Cindy Foreman writes, we prayed over the course of 3 years through multiple pregnancy losses, and this year God answered the prayer for our girls, each one giving birth to healthy babies within 5 weeks of each other. She's been waiting for grandchildren to come, and they finally are here. Jesus has put the disciples in the boat. He's been in the mountainside, and the boat's gone a good distance. So Jesus doesn't know where they are, and in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out walking on the lake. And when the disciples see him, they are terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. Now, to understand this, we have to understand the way they did things in this day. They had a way of taking a rope and putting some weights on the bottom of it. And that way they could tell how deep the bottom was. And if they were going to put down their nets, they would have to put them down in more shallow water. So it was important. But they would believe it was a ghost because of that sounding. They could go as deep as 120 to 130, according to some of the experts. But the Sea of Galilee's deepest point is 141 feet. How do you explain that you've got all this rope and you should be able to find the bottom, but you can't find the bottom? The way they did it, they decided that the Sea of Galilee didn't have a bottom there. What they had was a portal going down to hell itself. So they came up with the way that people were taken down the portal. A ghost would come out of the portal, and he would take the men that were due to go, and they'd go down the portal to their final destination. So the disciples are scared to death. This is it. The ghost is here. The ones who are going to take us for all eternity down to hell. And they see Jesus. And he said, take courage. Don't be afraid. I'm not a ghost. Peter looks up and says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. And Jesus said, come. And Peter got down out of the boat and walked on water. But he sees the wind and the waves. His natural tendency is that he can't walk on water, even though he is. And when the winds and the waves convince him he's going to sink, he cries out, Lord, save me. And Jesus reaches out and catches him by the hand and said, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And they climbed into the boat, and the wind died down. And then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Sometimes we look at this and we belittle Peter. How come he doubted? Couldn't he have just a little faith? Why did he get out of the boat and sink? And we forget some very, very important points. Peter walked on water. There were 11 other guys who were afraid enough that they never got out of the boat, let alone walked on water. Have you ever been there? You had faith, but it was tough. It's good to remember that Peter was supported by Jesus all the way. Second, it didn't happen until Peter took his eyes off Jesus. Then he started to sink. If he'd have kept his eyes focused on Jesus, if he'd have kept going to Jesus, he wouldn't have noticed the winds and the waves. He didn't notice them in the beginning. He wouldn't have noticed them when he started to sink. And that brings us to our third and probably the most important. When Peter started to sink, he turns back to Jesus as his remedy out. All of us are going to have times when we doubt. When things don't quite happen the way we want to see them happen. When we begin to sink in life and wonder if God knows what's happening down here. Don't take your eyes off Jesus. And if you do, focus them back on him. Because Jesus reached down and pulled him out of the water. And it's Jesus who takes him back to the boat where he's safe. And it's Jesus who makes all the difference. So that leads me to your homework assignment for this week. Find ways that you can keep your eyes off your fears, off sinking, and you keep your eyes on Jesus this week. Don't let our situations get us down. Let's keep reaching out to Christ, and he'll make all the difference. Jesus, sent here to redeem us, sent here so that we could keep our eyes on him and know that God is involved with us and that he is watching over us. Thank you for taking this time to be with us tonight. I hope you come back next week. Good night.